Hello, everyone. A warm welcome to our second RAMSES webinar. It's great to have you all here with us today. My name is Peleikis. I am working with ICLEI, and we are in the RAMSES project responsible for the stakeholder involvement. We do have today a very interesting program ahead of us. So with me are three of our project partners. We will start in a while with a presentation by Gerardo Sanchez Martinez from WHO on the health impacts of climate change. From that, then we will zoom a bit out and look at the adaptation decision-making process in cities in more general. And I'm happy to welcome Nicole De Paula from the University of Versailles for this part. And finally, we will move out again a bit more and address the transformation or the transition towards urban climate resilience with a presentation by Maddelen Mendizabal from TECNALIA in Bilbao. We will then close with a brief Q&A session, and I would like to briefly explain to you how this works. You have probably already noticed that you as participants are muted during this webinar, but we would like to nonetheless encourage you very much to pose your questions already during the presentations. You can use for this purpose the Q&A window on the right bottom of your WebEx window, and please write then or choose writing to all panelists, and your questions will be collected throughout the webinar, and I will then post them at the end of this session. If you have more general comments, or if you should have any problems with the technical settings, you can write this as well, but then please use the chat window for this purpose. Before I very soon hand over to Gerardo for the first presentation, I would like to give you a very brief overview on the project. Many of the participants we have today have been involved in previous RAMSES activities already, so I will keep this really concise and short. We are in the RAMSES Consortium 11 partners from very different scientific backgrounds, and the project is led by the Potsdam Institute for Climate Impact Research. We are doing research for cities in transitions, and indeed the main project or overall project aim is to provide quantified evidence of the impact of climate change, and in particular we are looking at the costs and benefits of adaptation. Our focus in the project is on cities, and therefore we are cooperating with several cities to conduct case study analysis and develop and apply the tools and methods developed within the project. And you can see here on the right the cities that we are particularly engaged with. The RAMSES project consists of 10 work packages contributing to providing knowledge and quantified evidence and costs of climate adaptation in cities. And these work packages look at this issue from different scientific perspectives. Work package 1 to 8, the more specific research and development work packages, while work package 9 is coordinating the participation of stakeholders. And in work package 10, we develop a practical toolbox for policymakers and other city stakeholders. A strong focus of the RAMSES project is on linking science to practice and co-creating the research. For this purpose, and also to give you a bit of background to this webinar we are having today, we are organizing throughout the project 3 stakeholder dialogues, where always the latest research findings, the research results are presented and shared, and stakeholders who are participating and involved support us in creating the further research outcomes. So to give you the background also for this event today, we had a stakeholder dialogue in May this year back-to-back to the ECHA conference in Copenhagen, where the same RAMSES partners were involved as today. At the stakeholder dialogue, the presentations were followed by exercises informing the research. Thus, what we will hear today are the latest research results, including already the outcomes of the stakeholder dialogue. If you should be interested in reading more about the stakeholder dialogue, we have prepared a report which is available on our project website. And I would also like to make you aware of the first policy brief, which you can find on the RAMSES website as well. And with this, I would like to hand over now to Gerardo, who will inform us about a very important aspect indeed regarding climate change, and this is the impacts of health. So Gerardo, the floor is yours.
With pleasure. Thank you very much, Julia. I guess the presentation will come up on the screen shortly. Apparently somebody is having problems with the sound. Maybe we want to address those before we start speaking. Well, I mean, I might as well get started in a manner of introduction. What I'm going to be talking about today is health impacts of climate change and also adaptation to those health impacts, but from an urban perspective. The urban reality matters supremely in the relationship between climate change and climate, their impacts on health. There is a lot of modulation influences that have to be taken into account. And those also matter for the way adaptation is planned and implemented. But the most important thing is to start by the basics. And the first important thing is, of course, to distinguish whether we are talking about impacts that are due to weather, to climate variation, or to climate change. Those are things that happen at very, very different time scales. And the way we can attribute the health impacts to those climate or climate-related exposures is also very different. What we're going to be talking about today is health impacts that are attributable to climate change. That is, to the variation occurring systematically now, well, or actually rather quickly, in the climate across many years. So we're going to be talking about the health impacts that are additional to those that we already had observed due to either climate variability or to climate exposures or even to extreme weather events. The reason why this is important is because we don't want to be accused of putting everything in the same basket. That is, of taking as climate change health impacts that actually don't have to do with climate change itself. They are related to climate, they are related to weather, but they don't have to do with climate change. That is, they are not additional to those that we were observing before. With that in mind, even if we take into account the influences of climate change only, there is still a very complex causal network from the impacts of climate to the impacts on health. We need to take into account environmental conditions, social conditions, and conditions of the health system, how much of the health outcomes we are able to prevent. And then we need to take into account that climate can affect health directly through direct exposures like extreme weather events, indirect exposures like changes in media, like water, air, food quality, in the vector ecology, and so on and so forth, as well as social and economic disruption, which is largely unpredictable since it has to do so much with behavior from the modeling perspective. So all of those exposures are modified by those influences in a very, very simple model. This gets even more complicated when we think about how this causal pathway is modified by the urban reality. What makes it different in that relationship between climate and health how does the city reality, the landscape, modify those influences. And a very important thing, of course, has to do with the physical reality of the city. So if you see this scheme that I'm showing now is very similar to the previous one. There's the influences of climate change to direct exposures, indirect exposures, and social and economic disruption. And the modifying influences are similar. But there are some modulating factors that are particular to the urban reality, to cities, such as the local infrastructure, the density of the population, and the demographics, as well as the health systems conditions also modified by the local infrastructure. So there's a number of physical realities and landscape realities that define the cities and that modulate those impacts on health from climate change. And this has to be taken into account not only in the health impact assessment, that is trying to figure out how much mortality and morbidity is due to climate change, but also in how to prevent those health impacts. We can more or less categorize the types of exposures and of health impacts that happen in cities. And we can see how the city reality or the urban landscape influences those associations. So for instance, in the case of temperature extremes, and thinking about heat specifically, heat increases cardiorespiratory mortality and morbidity, heat stroke, heat exhaustion, and so on. The effect of the urban landscape in this is very clearly an increasing effect. The effect of heat on health gets aggravated by the urban reality. The main factor, of course, for that is the phenomenon known as urban heat island effect, but that is not the only one. There are many things that make populations in cities more vulnerable to the health effects of heat. And the same thing happens also to other weather extremes on account of the increased population density, simply by the fact that more people live together, the more people are affected by the same weather extreme. The soil sealing as an important factor that prevents normal runoff and provokes flooding, and so on and so forth. There are a bunch of other factors where the influence of the city landscape is not so clear. And that has to do, for instance, with drought, where the health impacts of drought on health are very heavily mediated by social and market realities. And so we actually cannot figure out what the effect of the urban landscape is. Whether the influence is a positive or a negative one needs to be taken into account in the health impact assessment as well as in the adaptation. Basically, in summary, my message is that health impact assessment of climate change and adaptation for those health impacts needs to be done specifically in the context of the urban reality. The usual nationwide models of health impacts are of very little relevance when it comes to specific urban settings. If we focus on one specific type of exposure that affects health, heat, which is one that we know fairly well after very many epidemiological studies. We know very well what the health effects of heat are, heat and heat waves. We know the epidemiology of it. And we also know more or less how the exposure is going to change under climate change. This is part of what we are addressing in RAMSES. And we have, for instance, we're showing today one example from the city of Skopje. But we also know fairly well what is it that needs to be done to prevent those health impacts. And the question then is, if we know what needs to be done, why is it that we are not doing it yet? What is the rationale? What are the barriers that are preventing us from taking this action if we know what needs to be done? So if we think about the health effects of heat personally or individually, there are many specific factors that are particular to the individual that affect the risk of heat illness. There are those that affect behavior, having to do with physical or cognitive impairment, certain drugs, or simply age. There are other behavioral components like exercise, outdoor activity, also in the occupational settings, and medications. All of these factors, whether personal or more social, they affect the specific risk of the individual for heat illness. And this conforms a very specific, city-specific, if you will, profile, epidemiological profile of heat. If you look at this curve, what you see on the vertical axis is more or less a proxy of air temperature. And what you see in the curve is that as temperature increases, mortality goes down, and then it increases again as temperature increases again, right? So there is a threshold beyond which increases in temperature mean that mortality will be increased. Every population, every city has this kind of comfort zone, but the specific comfort zone for each city matters very much, because we don't want to be in a situation where, for instance, we're issuing public health alerts that are not truly very dangerous for the population. We want to make sure that when we are issuing one heat alert, then that's when the population really is going to be at risk. So it's very important to actually determine what this specific threshold of each particular population is. This curve was specifically ascertained for the city of Skopje, which is one of the case study cities of RAMSES. We further modeled what the heat exposure in Skopje was in the past, meaning how many heat wave days we could expect on average in each district of Skopje. And you could see there that there is a very clear pattern where red is more days of heat waves and blue is less days of heat waves, where as you enter the center of Skopje, you may expect many and many more days of heat waves, meaning you may expect a higher temperature, a higher exposure temperature, even if the ambient temperature in the region is the same in both places. So that means essentially that the people living closer to downtown in Skopje are going to be more exposed to heat, everything else being the same. But moreover, the number of heat wave days in any given year is actually projected to increase. If you see there is a projection for the years 2026 to 2045 under one specific scenario, and you can see how the red and yellow areas are expanding, but also you can see how the scale of the axis has changed. So it's many, many more days of heat waves that can be expected for everywhere in Skopje. And although still the same pattern prevails, there are more heat wave days in downtown. And this gets even worse towards the end of the century, although it also has to be said that the uncertainty of these estimations is also higher. So in short, you have a temperature response relationship at baseline, which along with the population projection and of course other reasonable projections, climate change scenarios and adaptation scenarios, which in principle could be known, thinking about the possible adaptation that you're proposing, you can see on the low right graph how the mortality is bound to increase in every possible scenario. So if everything else stays the same and its population projections are reasonable, then the mortality attributed to heat is bound to be increased in Skopje. And so under this circumstance, what is it that can be done, right? I mean, there must be some adaptation that can be taken, and it must be more effective the sooner you engage in it. However, sometimes this is not done. And one of the reasons, of course, has to do with the economics of it. It is expensive to get new programs running. And so this is the rationale behind our action here in RAMSES, where we're trying to shed light on what the economics of these issues are. First off, we of course would have to calculate how much economic loss is associated to those health impacts that we're talking about. Climate-induced health impacts, as any other health impacts, they result in an increase in premature mortality and an increase in morbidity, and those have economic consequences. From premature mortality, there's an inherent loss of welfare to society, but also there is a foregone income of the people who die before their retirement age. For the increase of morbidity, there is an increase in the needs for healthcare, as well as a loss of productivity in terms of sick leave, but also work and school absenteeism, and so on. All of those economic losses can be quantified, and there is plenty of tools for doing so. But in very simple terms, we can more or less summarize the health costs as the cost of healthcare, the cost of productivity, and the costs of premature mortality. So that's it for the health impact assessment part. Now, what can be done in terms of adaptation? In terms of adaptation, it's very clear what can be done from previous heat waves, from previous experiences we have had. In 2003, for instance, there was a very clear heat wave in Europe, and we learned a lot of lessons from them. We learned that there had to be an agreement on a lead body, that it had to be clear, everybody had to know what had to be done. There had to be an accurate and timely alert system, a health information plan. There had to be strategies for reduction in indoor heat exposure. We had to take into account the vulnerable groups. We had to have some preparedness for the health system and the social care system, and then taking into account other cross-sectional issues like long-term urban planning and real-time surveillance and evaluation. All these are generally accepted. And yet, many heat health action plans don't have a complete, all the elements, all the core elements that they need. And even if they do, the flow of information is not exactly clear. The flow of information here is in very simple terms, what ideally it should look like, from the lead body to the health sector and then all the stakeholders. And I would like to bring your attention there that the stakeholders there include the local governments. So that's actually one of the most important issues here. And then all the rest of core elements, there will have to be clear roles and responsibilities assigned for each one of the players. But then again, here comes the key question: how much does it cost? I mean, the adaptation costing inputs are crucial. I mean, we don't want that the economic argument is used routinely to actually prevent engaging in adaptation without actually knowing exactly how much money is required for that adaptation. And so our approach in RAMSES, of course, is to disaggregate exactly the resource use actions that are necessary. We'll have to first figure out the adaptation actions, then how much resources are required for each one of those actions, who is the responsible implementing agency, and what proportion of the final cost is incurred by each one of the economic players in societies. So with all of that information, we'll be able to actually figure out whether the adaptation that we are proposing is cost effective, if there are more benefits than costs, and we'll be able to advocate for it more effectively. In the case of dystopia, we're still gathering data, but so far cost indicators suggest that the costs are somewhere around and less than 100,000 euros per year, and that is far less than what we have calculated in costs, even though I don't see the slide here. I don't know, Julia, if that is the one that you removed. Anyway, perhaps I can show it later. The tool that we are proposing as part of our work package here in RAMSES allows to calculate the economic cost due to health impacts of climate change, the cost of adaptation to avoid those health impacts. It can estimate the benefits of adaptation if we know what the effectiveness of adaptation is, and then we can calculate and report those indicators to support decision making. It is implemented in the form of an Excel-based tool, and we'll of course be making it available as well as the guidance on how to use it as part of the publications of RAMSES. The key messages are that the health impacts of climate change entail serious economic consequences in terms of mortality, of healthcare costs, and of lost productivity, that these costs can be calculated approximately, not in a very fine way, but enough for adaptation planning purposes, that health adaptation measures are usually well known, and they are usually public health programs that are either in place or considered. The local health authorities can also engage in health adaptation, and that the estimates of costs and benefits of adaptation can support.
It seems that I lost the presentation and Gerardo's voice for a couple of seconds. I'm not sure if that was the case for everyone. I hope you were at the end of your presentation, Gerardo, and I didn't cut your word now. But I would like to thank you so much for the interesting presentation. And I would like to remind also everyone, also those who joined later, to post your questions, please, in the Q&A box that you see at the bottom right corner of your WebEx window. We are collecting all of them and will post them at the end of the session. So we have understood a bit better now the complex relationship between climate change and health, and in particular the effects of climate change and heat on human health, which will be increasingly a problem for many European cities, and in particular the insights on economic implications have been very valuable, I think, for many of us. So I would like to move forward and broaden our scope, and together with Nicole look now at the more general decision-making process on adaptation, and in particular on approaches and experiences to inform and trigger decision-making. Nicole, I'm handing over now to you.
Is it fine?
The floor
Okay.
is yours.
Thank you, Julia. Hi, everyone. Thank you for tuning in, and thank you, ICLEI, for bringing us together today. So my contribution, as I said, this afternoon will be a broader perspective on approaches and experience to inform adaptation decision-making. As you briefly explained, I'm part of the work package 7 within RAMSES, named Urban Policies and Governance. And basically, our goal there is to understand why some cities are doing better than others. I think this is a question that, as Gerardo mentioned before, although sometimes we do have the science, still there are a lot of challenges that cities cannot advance. As I personally think the issue, the case of cities is fascinating. We do see a lot of potential to bring a lot of solutions for climate change. At the same time, there are a lot of challenges. And if you see, just to give a brief overview, when more than 70% of greenhouse gases globally are produced in cities, and 2/3 of a global energy consumption, there is a lot that we can do that. There. And yet the problem that we face today, yet with the increase of natural disasters and of course the inability of governments to really take climate change into account, even though the science started much more with giving us some alerts that something needs to be done, we still see little advancement in the adaptation side. Much more is done on mitigation, and this is something that we would like to bridge this gap. So, of course, if you hear this afternoon, the importance of adaptation is growing. We all know that mitigation won't be enough. And to achieve results, all these elements that I listed here will have to be mobilized. So natural capital, financial resources, we need cognitive capacity, we need to understand social behavior as well, and institutional innovation. And these two, the last two, social behavior, institutional innovation, it's really something that Work Package 7 is focusing. In this discussion, it's very common to hear about what needs to be done. We need to mainstream climate change in development policies. We need to integrate these facts and to have a more resilient society. But as we see, it's having a resilient society is not self-evident, and local authorities still face a lot of challenges with how to launch this process. I list some of the most common questions that needs to be addressed. For example, the number 4 and 5, what local governments have tried and how successful previous measures have been measured and understood. This is something that we are also trying to do when we go on the field and trying to have a more concrete experience from the field. And during the Q&A, we could also, one thing that is we always pose as a question in our group is what type of questions, what local authorities need to know to launch a position on adaptation, a plan. So where to start is one of the most common questions. And the notion of adaptation cycle here is very much, it's one of the most common ways to describe. We have several graphs that illustrate the idea of an adaptation cycle, but I chose this one because it places the stakeholder engagement at the center. And for us, this is a very important aspect, and some of the things that I would like to focus during this 15, 20 minutes that I have. And it also has the advantage of placing these arrows that you see in a way that each circle seems to fit each other. So this approach that I still would call in a way called a linear one illustrates one method to conceive an adaptation plan. And we see that, for example, when we talk about tools for decision making, you usually need for decision making not only adaptation but mitigation as well. You need usually involves urban planning and infrastructure decisions, local greenhouse gas inventories in a way that's standardized, linked with national inventory methods. Here we would like to highlight the importance of having a national policy supporting local decisions as well. And then the third would be urban vulnerability mapping or risk assessments. All this entered in as some tools for decision making. And why this is important? Because when you need to compare efforts, you need to measure. But still, this remains a problem. And you see, when you think in terms of in our work package, we've been questioning some of the problems with analyzing this as a cycle. And because adaptation it's a non-linear process, we see a lot of difficulty in going step by step, trying to develop these ideas. So in practice, when you also have the impact models, they're mostly available for specific sectors, and then water, forest, agriculture, they're sectors that are most developed. And it's really hard to how you measure having this complex overview of the city as a system. It's still very difficult. So one ambiguity that usually happens when you have also competing science, and it could bring some difficulties to have a comprehensive. So the science itself is not unanimous. And the other aspect that could create ambiguity, and when you're starting your adaptation plan, it's the exclusion of some stakeholders. So what we do, what we observe is that this toolkit sometimes or training tools, they usually tend to ignore some of the most important factors which are political aspects. So politics, and in the end, it's still very much important and remains overlooked. One solution that we usually find as well in the literature would be how the most advanced way or better way to start will be with multiple policies that so-called no regret policies, in a way that let's start with the easiest tools or policies that wouldn't bother the majority of some conflicting interests. But we see that it still remains very hard to distribute these benefits and costs of some actions all over, considering future generations. So you still see a lot of the present interest taking into account. And the role of policymakers is really about trying to overcome this challenge and to create enabling conditions for effective and inclusive decision making. And why the inclusive? Because we noticed that the problems of inequality remains a constant one. Climate change affects the most vulnerable, and I think this idea is very much present in the case of heat, as Gerardo was explaining. We do have elderly, youth, people with disabilities, women that some sort of plans could not take this, at least not enough, into account. So the climate resilient gap will really be closed if adaptation planning tackled these issues. Here I would like to highlight there are two types of equity to consider. The first one, distributive. When you do think about, it's important to think about the distribution of the burden and the benefits as a result of actions to cope with climate change. And the second would be procedural. These two questions here, who has a voice in decision-making process and how equally is the power distributed, are questions that deserve further attention. And this is something also that when you're studying governance, we're trying to prioritize. Because vulnerable groups are often excluded, it's not a novelty, but the interests of the wealthier could predominate. And here I'm thinking about fast-growing cities in Asia, for example. They are indeed advancing very fast, but not necessarily in the most democratic way. So again, adaptation is more about politics than usually thought. And it's just to give one simple example, when you have recommendations to deal with heat, saying people to stay home, usually there's a tendency to ignore, for example, that people have bad housing conditions, and not necessarily everyone will have air conditioning. So participatory tools are fundamental, even though they seem self-evident, but when you go in the field, it's very hard to find this in practice. Two examples that could try to overcome this challenge of inequalities. One tool would be to use technology to map these vulnerable groups in relation to projected impacts of climate change. And then another aspect that could deserve to be studied a little bit more is how you could create civic space to enhance this decision-making and deliberation. It's not only about, we hear a lot that we need to include the most vulnerable, but in the end you realize that spaces for that is still missing. So in the end, I like these two questions. Gerardo mentioned also that how important it is to have the notion of cost, and this is one of the major contributions of our project. Indeed, we still need to understand how all this would cost. But also we need to, when you're evaluating the success of certain adaptation strategies, it's difficult to, you need to understand the purpose of that as well. So asking the right questions is the most important aspect of adaptation. So are we doing the right thing in terms of, what are we adapting for? And the second would be, are we doing the right things in terms of what are we doing? Are we still doing what we promised? Is it still coherent? So, and because there are a lot of things that also deserve to be better understood is what about maladaptation? Sometimes you do have a plan, but you could be creating more harm than good. To move, I'll be quicker in the second part, because I'm assuming that the next presentation will be able to deal more in depth with enablers and barriers. Even though we still have the science, we still know, we know that there are difficulties to implement that. But to start with enablers, today it seems clear that 80% of societies that have started an adaptation plan, and here it's worth realizing that still about 20% or a little bit more now, I think with figures of 3 years ago, we have 20% of cities who really have an adaptation plan. And usually this is connected to a major triggering events, floods, droughts, extreme weather events. For example, here, if you see the image of New York after Sandy, it was really a game changer, not in terms for not only for the city, but for the United States as well. It was a pretty shocking image to have that in a developed country. So this was important to move things fast. And today you do have New York City as one of the most advanced in terms of resources about around $20 billion being spent on that to cope as a response to Sandy. And then moving to Rio de Janeiro, my country, Brazil, you having also political leadership, it seems to be a very important fact to advance things as well. You do need support from the highest levels. And for example, Eduardo Paes, who is the mayor of Rio de Janeiro, he is also the chairman of C40, and this seems to have a connection with some advancements there. And Rio has also launched a strategy in resilience. But as a researcher, we are very much used to finding more barriers than enablers. And so we see that still there is a recognition that lack of capacity here is often a difficult thing to advance. When I said that New York City has an advanced plan, it's still very recent. They started in 2013. But having a strong network of academic and practitioners are usually very important. And when you think about other cities in developing countries, it would be hard to see such investments. So here is an interesting list that gives answers partially what Gerardo mentioned before, why action sometimes remains blocked. And you have sectorial planning, as I said, it's hard to have a systemic view of the city. Levels of power and authority that usually could not correspond to the action that needs on climate change. For example, usually in budgetary issues and legal aspects. Political interest that when you don't have leaders supporting your idea, it's very hard to move forward. Capacity building, institutional factors, dysfunctional communication. Here I would like to think about the example of Katrina, and when there were some leaders in New Orleans who really explained how basic facts of, for example, to communicate with the population in the situation facing the emergency, they didn't have a way to communicate with simple things that no one thinks about in advance. So lack of funding as well, and private sector, lack of involvement of private sector or clarity of how they could help. An interesting aspect here that I think our work package contributes a lot is that you do need to go beyond the evaluation, the economic lenses to understand adaptation, because it really involves culture and social values as well. For example, putting a price on everything and every action brings some clarity, and it's still really important. But if you have no markets, or this intertemporal considerations are not, maybe they cannot advance any actions. So we do believe that how to influence behavior is still one of the most important aspects of having an adaptation plan that is advancing in a coherent way. If I take the example of New York, it's because we had a mission there and more in-depth understanding. And when this team analyzed the documents and also made several interviews with people on the ground, they noticed the absence of the term vulnerability. And there was really this idea of bringing, instead of speaking about vulnerability, let's talk about resilience. And I think this reflects also something that it's very much part of the American culture of this empowerment and bouncing back, and really about resistance. So the society is not necessarily vulnerable, but they also can act. And this is an interesting aspect that we need to capture. Of course, there's not one size fits all. There are several conditions here that for proactive planning and effective decision making. So to this summarize a little bit, the main point would be the inclusion of the most vulnerable. In the case of heat is very important. Strengthening the links between decision makers and the scientific community is something that RAMSES is trying to do as well. Inclusion of a robust process for stakeholder inputs. As I said, you need to create spaces for this deliberations, and ensuring that adaptation plan is crafted with equity issues in mind. Of course, avoid sectoral barriers in urban planning. This is not necessarily related to climate change, but in development as well, you do need a better coordination. This is not necessarily a new problem, but climate change accentuates a lot this issue. So, and finally, use the social capital of vulnerable populations by better mixing top-down and bottom-up approach to decision-making in climate aspects. And again, even though I use the term vulnerable, we do believe the societies, they have a lot to contribute. So if you're still awake, here's my final slide. In terms of conclusion, for work package 7, we do believe that the more we go on the field, the less we feel inclined to provide this deterministic prediction that what needs to be done in adaptation. We're really trying to understand some tendencies and lessons from each cities, and then you saw at the beginning, Julia explained the main cities in the project. But we're still facing this difficulty how to measure progress, and this is not only a challenge for the cities itself, but for us as researchers, there's still a lot to be done in terms of how to understand what is success, and it has to go beyond economic aspects. There's still evidence these governments, they remain very much isolated in their own bureaucracies. And one of the conclusions that we need to include more subjective perceptions of individuals, because they are really also, they can contribute a lot of how to improve these strategies. So with that, I would like to conclude and thank you very much for your time this afternoon. I can be reached in this email, Twitter, all this social media, and be glad to take questions if you have any at the end. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Nicole, for your interesting insights and presentation. And in particular, I believe the focus on equity is a very important one, and something that is apparently not considered so far in a systemic way in many cities. So thanks a lot for that. I would like to remind everyone again to post your questions in the Q&A field. A couple of you are already doing, and we are collecting the questions here to be posted at the very end. With the next presentation, we would like to zoom out even more, and I will soon give the floor to Maddelen Mendizabal from TECNALIA. TECNALIA is doing research on transition to urban climate resilience in the RAMSES project, and Maddelen will share some of the results of their work on identifying key drivers for such transitions with us. So Maddelen, the floor is yours.
Hi, hello everyone. Yeah, thank you, Julia. The question that we want to address in this presentation is how can we stimulate the transition in urban context? And in this, relative to this issue, what we saw in literature is that there are several approaches. Sorry, I can't move. Okay, now yes, we can see all the same presentation, sorry. What we saw in the literature is that there are several approaches and conceptual models that study the sustainable transition. And we already group all this work in two main communities that are, on the one hand, the transition community, and on the other hand, the climate adaptation community. And we proceed to compare both approaches in relation to the analyzed system in one and another communities, the description of the processes done in both communities, the different approaches defined, and the methods and tools that support the transition studies in each community. So in this slide, we can see a comparison of both communities through the mentioned field of or dimension that are the system analysis, the kind of governance, the stage and steps of the processes, the different approaches, and the method and tools used. And now I will start showing its dimension in the following slides. In case of climate adaptation community, we can see that the system analyzed in this community is the socio-ecological one. And in the case of transition community, we see that the system analyzed in this community is the socio-technical one. And even both considers the two systems, as you can see in the figure, they have common approaches and common vision. Both systems are displaying some kind of complex, dynamic, multi-scale, and adaptive properties. And in both cases also, the recommendation for the sustainable governance emphasizes learning, experimentation, and iterations. And related to the governance, in case of climate adaptation community, is the adaptive management that is considered the governance of this community. And the adaptive management is a kind of process of creating adaptability and transformability in socio-ecological systems. And is more related to resilience. In the other hand, we can see in the figure the transition community that is considering the transition management as governance. And this in turn gives the gradual, continuous process of transformation on one hand of socio-political landscape, also of socio-technical practice, and also the structural character of the society from one equilibrium to another. Okay. In case of the stages and steps of the processes, we have compared both communities, and in both cases they follow a comparable process of subsequent stage and activities. In case of transition, we have 1, 2, 3, and 4 stages that you can see them in the picture, and which are with the we can see them like the plane that is in the first step, the pre-development stage. Then we have a take-off stage and acceleration, and then an stabilization. And if we compare with the climate adaptation community, we see that in adaptive cycle we have reorganization, growth, conservation, and collapse stages. And this you can see also on the right part of the slide. And you can see that this is a cycle process. Then, related to the steps of the processes, and you can see in the left part of the slide with the numbers from 1 to 7, the 7 steps that are related to transition management. If we compare both communities, we can see that both have a lot of similarities. In case of transition, we have the analysis of the system, and in climate adaptation, we have the problem structuring that at the end it can be the same. Then we have in both communities the envisioning and the pathway definition. And finally, we have in case of transition, we have the experimenting, assessing, and translating. And then in case of climate adaptation, we have the implementing, evaluating, monitoring, and learning steps. So at the end, we can see and compare both approaches, but they have their own processes and steps, but they have a lot of similarities. in related to the approach, method, and tools used in both communities, we want to highlight the most popular approach or method used in both communities. In the case of transition, the most popular one will be the socio-technical transition theory, in which the socio-technical transition are structural changes, both physical and administrative. And the core component of this approach is the multi-level perspective. And this multi-level perspective defines interactions between 3 levels, and you can see in the left part of the slide in the figure. We have the niche innovation at micro level scale. We have the socio-technical regime at mesoscale, and we have the socio-technical landscape at macro level. Then, in the other hand, we have the case of climate adaptation community, and here we have 3 adaptation approaches, which are, on one hand, adjustment or incremental adaptation, we have transformative adaptation, and we have reformist adaptation or transition. The incremental adaptation has the purpose of adjust the system to the new situation for climate risk management. Then, in the case of transformative adaptation, this results fundamentally in change in the biophysical, social, or economic components from one function, form, or location to another one. And the last, the reformist or adaptation or the transition, this occupies a middle ground between the incremental and the transformative adaptation. The proposed adaptation in this line alters the rules and the decision-making processes, but didn't significantly alter the norms and the principles. So it is operating within the boundaries of existing systems, and that's an important difference. In this context, and regardless the approach which we are choosing, because we can choose the incremental one, the transformative, or the transition one, independently which one we are choosing, we are able to use methods or approach that support the cities into the adaptation processes. And the method or tool that we want to highlight it in this presentation is the dynamic adaptive policy pathway, which consists on a combination of adaptive policymaking and adaptation pathways. This approach can assist in the designing of dynamic adaptive plans, and we can choose if we want to have a transformative adaptation or a transition or an incremental adaptation. So, taking into account all the approaches we reviewed previously, we decided to select and define one approach with several tools that are supporting this approach, and this definition of the framework, we want to be the general framework for the RAMSES study on transition. And we are representing this approach in this figure, and it's mainly based on the dynamic adaptive policy pathway that already I mentioned before, and it consists on 11 steps, which are grouped in 3 objectives. That are, the first one is, the first objective will be the system map, where the impacts are analyzed, the key problems are detected, and the future vision is created. Then we have the second objective of planning, where the pre-identified adaptations are characterized, assessed, and prioritized. And last, we have the third objective of managing, where how, when, and who is defined through adaptation pathway approach. And then the transition factors or triggers of change are detected and defining, and the monitoring system is defining also. As you see in the picture, in the following slide, we want to go deeper in the point 9 of transition factors or triggers of change detection. So to do so and to go deeper in this issue, we define some exercises which methodology is presented in this figure. First, this exercise was consisting in 3 steps. The first one is with previous work, we did some research to gather some kind of information related to impact and vulnerability of the cities, and we presented this information in the first stakeholder dialogue, which helped detecting the hotspot and key problems. You can see some kind of examples in the bottom of this slide. And then we move to the second point, which is based on these detected key problems, and the objective is to define and create a future vision, which consists in a positive statement of the key problems. And finally, we have the third step that consists defining the condition to reach the vision. At the end, this will be the transition factors, and we validate this detection of transition factor in the second stakeholder dialogue, and we prioritize them. Okay. Now I'm going to show some results we get from the stakeholder dialogue and from the research we did. And I will start with the first point of city vulnerability, where we were able to define the impact change in which we detect the weakness of the city. And here you can show in the slide 2 examples. And this is the base and will serve to define the future vision. So here we have the 2 steps of the exercise, but the third step of the exercise, which consists on the detection of the triggers of change or transition factors, we want to summarize the results obtained in this stakeholder dialogue together with the results we have from the literature review. And in this sense, we wanted to show you 8 transition factors that we are going to order from the most important to the less important. And in this transition factor detection, we want to highlight the most popular ones. In the first place, we have the political leadership, authority, and skill for disruptive innovation and change. And this trigger of change must be this must be a long-term commitment, and it is more important in the initial stage of the process, and then sustaining the momentum over the time. And finally, the requirements that need to have the leader are, from one hand, the high skill level, and in the second hand, the strong qualities of integrity. The second factor are grouped on regulation and codes, and are accountability, pricing, taxation, penalties, and incentives. In this case, more related, if we are focusing only in accountability, legality, and procedural feasibility, these are common barriers in the stage of the managing phase. You can see in the figure where is located the managing phase into the cycle. And therefore, the implementation of an action must be legal and feasible within the existing framework, unless we want to change a law or process. In this case, we need to create a new one. In relation to the third factor, that is the learning from disasters, and this can be a trigger of change because individuals look at new problems, tasks, or solutions through the lens of their pre-existing values, preferences, beliefs, norms, and experiences. Therefore, learning from disaster can promote changes. The fourth factor is education and awareness. We want to remark in relation to this factor the importance of the effective communication and the availability, accessibility, and ability to use data. In this case, the key issue is which and how information is created, how it is communicated, and who delivers and receives it. All these are common barriers in the stage of the understanding and planning phases, and they are linked with the society and political sphere. The five factors are grouped also in co-responsibility, increased public-private interface, and social participation. These are common barriers in the stage of the managing phase, and in this case, the changes are often induced by voluntary agreement, societal pressure, financial and market stimuli, but all need a facilitation, and this is an important issue. And to promote change, we need also to provide opportunities for the interaction, collaborative partnership between municipal practitioners and climate change response experts. And last but not least, we need to consider a broad range of actors and institutions into the processes. Then we can see the next factor, that is the living lab approach for innovation. In this case, it is considered that innovation and business emerge from the experiment, but we detect the need of more development or standard approach to gain comparability between experience and have the possibility to scale up or transfer the experience. In the seventh place, we have the informed, inclusive, and adaptive multi-level governance, because the implementation of action is influenced in important ways by the governance and also by a larger social context, and because the municipalities need key pieces of legislation to pass a higher level of governance, because municipalities are often not empowered to implement critical climate change strategies. And last, we have the integrated and adaptive planning and management, and in this case, the previous experiences reveal that adaptation is likely to be implemented only if it is consistent with programs designed to cope with non-climatic stress. That's why climate adaptation needs to be mainstreamed. But at the same time, this needs to eventually become more independent and with robustness in the long run. So need to go with something else, but at the same time must to be independent and robust. Moreover, adaptation needs a monitoring and evaluation mechanism, first to do a post-evaluation of the decision, and second, this will help in a learning process. So to close the presentation, I would like to summarize some ideas. And we saw that, in the first place, we saw that the adaptation to climate change at the local level is facing many obstacles. And in response to this, we want to define the triggers of change or transition factors that should enable or overcome the detected obstacles and should allow the success of effective and efficient action, and finally should help moving the socio-ecological and socio-technical system to a sustainable stage. But we also conclude that the transition is a very broad concept, and this makes it difficult to define precisely transition factors. Nevertheless, the core issue appears to be facilitating the translation of existing capacity into action. And this facilitation depends most fundamentally on reworking the path-dependent institutional structures, organizational culture, and policy-making procedures. In this context, the ultimate task is to expose the roots of the most significant barriers, shift the underlying development path, and formulate a coherent program for local climate change response. And in response to this, we defined an integrated conceptual framework for transition, which is disaggregated in several consecutive steps, and also are grouped on system map, which is to analyze impact, detect key problems, and create future visions, the planning to characterize, assess, and prioritize adaptation options, and the managing, that is define how, when, and by whom for adaptation pathway approach, identify the triggers of change, and define and implement plan, strategy, and monitor them. Therefore, the identification of triggers of change will be a step after defining the pathway and before implementing a plan, and most likely will be context specific. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Maddelen, for sharing with us how transition factors can be identified and how broad actually the range of such factors can be or is. And we are looking forward very much to your upcoming research results and learn on how to move from incremental adaptation to more innovative and transformative approaches. So thank you for that. We have been throughout the webinar collecting your questions, and we are moving now to the Q&A session. If you have any final questions to the last presentation we just heard, please post them now in the Q&A box. And we will start with the questions now regarding the first presentation. We unfortunately had, or not we, but Gerardo had some problems with the WebEx system, so he shared his answers to the questions with me, and I have clustered the questions a bit so as to pose now one question for each of our presenters. And the questions related to Gerardo's presentation were related to the Excel-based costing tool that he presented. So these were rather concrete questions. The first one on when this tool that was mentioned in the presentation will become available. And the second one, what level of detail is needed to use this tool. So I imagine that this tool can be of interest for many cities trying to estimate the costs of climate health adaptation. And indeed, the tool is currently being finalized and will be made available early next year latest. The tool has been developed for cities also with limited level of detail, so it should be possible to use it even if no expert knowledge or no deep expert knowledge is available. As Gerardo was presenting, they developed it or used it already in the case of Skopje. So the intention was to make it possible to use it also for cities without large data amounts. Then we had first of all an interesting comment regarding Nicole's presentation. So this referred to the Urban Adaptation Support Tool that has been developed by Mayors Adapt. For those of you who should not be familiar with it before, it's available on the Climate Adapt platform and uses also different stages as presented by Nicole in her slides. And then there was a question relating to inequity, an aspect that Nicole emphasized in her presentation. So the question from a practitioner as well related to the fact if there have been any experiences on how to consider this aspect, which is very important in adaptation decision making more systematically. Is there, Nicole, maybe any experience from your work with the RAMSES city or other cities which you would like to share with our participants?
I can. Thank you, Judah. Thank you, everyone, for your reactions. I have a brief comment. We are actually working on that. And the first part of our work so far, the work package 7, was bringing these ideas together. And now I agree that we need to have more concrete examples of cities and how they are actually dealing with this. And what we are currently writing about is the case of New York, which we have more experience, and which I think this paper will be ready end of this year, beginning of the next, and feel free also to contact me and I can put you in touch with other researchers who are actually in the field. And New York, apparently they had some experience with the involvement of youth and also a lot of practical experience on ecosystem restoration that were developing beyond the participation of the government. So independent activities that were indeed happening, showing that first the power of empowering people and informing, empowering, and sharing this experience. So I think New York was a good example. I'm currently doing more concrete research on the case of London and Antwerp. So I hope to share this at the end of this year. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Nicole. I hope this answered the question. I would like to move forward now with 2 questions related to the last presentation. First one is a rather concrete one, which again by a practitioner or city representative asking, will there be an opportunity to learn about how concretely sustainability transitions in cities can be supported? Is there, for example, any published project results planned or any stakeholder event where this can be shared in more detail with practitioners? Maddelen, would you like to respond to this one?
Sure. We are now working in the conceptual framework stage, but then we are going to apply the approach in 3 case studies into the RAMSES project. One will be Bilbao, and the other 2, we don't know if they are going to be Antwerp and London or other one, but we want to test the approach in those case studies and then share with other cities the results and to see if it's useful or not, or if it's too context specific, or if we can do some kind of general conclusions and so on. So I hope in 2016 we are going to present the results of the case studies, and we are going to be able to share this with other municipalities and cities.
you very much, Maddelen. Then there's a second and I would consider last question regarding disasters as triggers of change, and the question is whether you have any experiences if disasters are triggering change, in how far disasters also break the lens applied to resilience planning. So whether I understand it that way, that disasters providing new experiences, whether this then also changes the lens through which decision makers are addressing climate adaptation.
Yeah, the previous experiences say that the cities that face natural disasters and have historical events with high frequency and high intensity, and it's expected that in the future, due to climate change, they are going to have more severe or more frequent disasters or events. They have some kind of learning process in the past, and this is helping them moving to other stage into the city, because they already have or they already faced this disaster, and they already implement adaptations to reduce the vulnerability or the hazard. And we saw that there is a relation between the number of historical events, and the degree of the adaptive capacity. So somehow they are gaining, winning in adaptive capacity.
Thank you very much, Maddelen, and thank you very much indeed to all our presenters today, and also to all the participants and your interest in our webinar today. We would very much like to stay in contact with you. The RAMSES project will still run for 2 more years, during which we have many opportunities still for exchange and engaging with you. In 2016, we are organizing our 3rd RAMSES stakeholder dialogue, and as well another webinar as well. And there will be training events organized, which will feature in particular include the health tool that Gerardo mentioned at the very beginning, but also other RAMSES tools and methodologies. So on all these things, you can stay updated on our project website. So I would like to welcome you to visit our website and subscribe to our RAMSES newsletter as well, in case you haven't done so far, but also to contact us directly via email or through other channels. So just as a last remark, we will send you the slides of this webinar via email in the next couple of days, and we'll also share with you, and thanks again also for this comment, share with you the link to the urban adaptation tool for those of you who may not know it yet. So you'll find that in the email as well. Thank you very much to all of you, and hope to see you soon again in any of our events. Goodbye.